Dear colleagues, dear colleagues who participated in our previous events, dear colleagues who just joined, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know colleagues are from the East. Thanks for joining this panel discussion organized jointly by the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, GFDRR, and the Global Weather Enterprise Forum. Today's event, entitled Building the New Economy, the Role of the Weather Enterprise, opens Global Weather Enterprise Forum program this year. Besides this event in 2022 this year, we plan to organize discussions dedicated to 4 other areas: energy, urban environment, agriculture, water, particularly in connection with nature-based solutions. We suggest to discuss or debate what role weather enterprise should play in the development of these important areas in response to climate change challenges. Hopefully, you and your colleagues will be interested to participate in these future events. Today's opening event includes 3 parts. The first part is recorded short interview with 2 eminent economists who are participating, Johannes Lien and Stefan Hallegatte. This part will be followed by a moderated panel discussion with 6 outstanding panelists, again including Johannes and Stefan. And the final part is our traditional Q&A session. Our moderator today will be the World Bank DRM specialist Anna Maria Masha Bogdanova. You will see her shortly. She will be interviewing our panelists. And now with this, let me now introduce Niels Holm Nielsen, GFDR manager, who will make opening remarks. Before inviting Niels, let me brief you who he is. Niels Nielsen joined the World Bank in 2006 as a junior professional officer in the Middle East and North Africa region. He has since held several positions, important positions, I should say, in DRM management in the Latin America and the Caribbean region and in Africa region, including most recently as a global lead for resilience and disaster risk management in the bank. Before joining the World Bank, he worked for the Inter-American Development Bank for 5 years, where he helped create the corporate policy on disaster risk management and established DRM as a development practice. Niels, I hope you're ready to address the team. Now we have over 50 people and still growing, and this event. Or is yours?
Thanks a lot, Vladimir. Thanks for inviting me to say a few comments. I guess I'll cover the sort of a little bit of the link to the broader institutional connection with the World Bank Group here of the agenda and the topic we're discussing today. But first, just to say that I think this particular focus on the conversation around Hydromet is super important and has been maybe under prioritized or later to come along. Of course, there's been economics work going on for decades in this space, but most of what the World Bank has been doing has focused, at least for many years, on more of the technical, the instrument side, the system side, and it's really only maybe in the last 5 or 8 years we have started to dig deeper and try to understand institutional and economic mechanisms around how these systems function and don't function and operate, and in unfortunately some cases don't operate. So this part of the conversation is still much needed and maybe one of the areas where there's most need to dig deeper. But welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us this morning if you're calling in from the Americas, and afternoon and evening maybe a few folks from Asia. As Vladimir said, this is a panel of the Global Weather Enterprise Forum. We open with this conversation today, the 2022 Forum program on how Hydromet services address today's societal priorities, including decarbonization, sustainable growth, strengthening resilience to natural hazards. So we'll hear the opinions of leading economists and experts in meteorology and climate finance on what the world of weather enterprise may look like in 2030 and beyond. So this topic is important for the World Bank's agenda. You may know already that the World Bank Group made mitigation and adaptation to climate change one of our main corporate priorities. The World Bank is already the largest multilateral provider of climate finance for developing countries. We have increased our financing to record levels over the past 2 years. In our climate change action plan that was launched last year, the World Bank Group has committed to increase our climate finance further on average to an average over 35% over the next 5 years. And 50% of the climate finance will support adaptation and resilience. So this is all to say that in the development discourse, development financing from our position as an institution, the climate question is absolutely central. And in that central question, of course, is the conversation that we have today. Weather, climate, and hydrological information is key to help countries prepare and cope with the weather extremes, but also to make better day-to-day decisions related to all aspects of life, whether it's urban development, transportation, energy supply and demand, food security, tourism, air quality. All of these areas have very clear links to an understanding, and in some cases management, the impacts of changing weather, changing climate. So there's a clear need for better hydromet services and predictions, and this we expect will continue to increase as society takes more steps towards the decarbonization of the economy as well. The economy is becoming more and more sensitive to weather across many sectors, and this process will continue probably to be exacerbated by climate change. The questions that we're trying to answer, or one key question we're trying to answer today is, are we ready to meet the demand for better hydromet services? And if not, then what can and what should be done? The answer most likely will be quite different for different types of countries and economies. And while investments in renewables have been underway for some time, the need to rebuild economies post-pandemic is a chance for many countries to provide cheaper and more accessible sources of electricity, optimize farm outputs, improve transportation systems, improve air quality, and develop mechanisms to cope with increased temperatures in an urban environment, for which they will need information. This is the potential to widen the economic opportunity, contributing to both short-term recovery, but also longer-term sustainable development and greater social inclusion. And all of this together demands more focus on the way how hydromet services are provided and the quality of these services. The World Bank alone has a portfolio of over 1 billion invested in hydromet and NMHSs and disaster management agencies, and much progress has been made. However, our response to climate emergency demands much better and more detailed and application-focused weather information to support both the disaster and economic resilience at a local level. So in the bank, we believe that better things can be achieved through better partnerships. And this is why we've been working together with WMO and UN agencies to elevate the hydromet agenda, including through establishment of the Alliance for Hydromet Development and setting up systemic observation financing facility. But we also feel that partnerships would not be complete without close engagement of private sector and academia, which are the real powerhouse of innovation and development in hydromet today. So this is the rationale behind the support that the GFDRR has been providing to the Global Weather Enterprise Forum, the platform that brings together many players from both public and private and academia sectors and international organizations. So I'm sure that today's discussion will be interesting. I look forward to hear from the distinguished panelists and the two presenters, and will be helpful to guide us all, and hopefully many of you at least, on the role hydromet services will play in building our new economies. Thank you very much. Vladimir, Masha, back to you.
Thank you, Niels. Welcome, everyone. Just a couple of words of how we're going to move forward. So we will now move to the pre-recorded interviews, and we had an opportunity to talk to Johannes Lien and to Stefan Hallegatt. And after that, we will go back to the panel and to the live discussion where we will present all the panelists and do a round of Q&As. So maybe right now we can move to the interviews, please.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series of roundtables exploring the evolving role of weather, climate, and hydrological services in the new decarbonized economy. I'm Masha Bagnanova, and by way of an introduction to our first roundtable, I've conducted 2 brief interviews to set the scene for our discussion. Both are with the economists Stefan Hallegate of the World Bank and Johannes Lin of the Brookings Institution. First of all, let me welcome Stefan Hallegate. Stefan, you're the most senior climate change advisor to the World Bank, and you're leading research which has a big role in shaping the contemporary vision of the economics of natural disasters and risk management, and also of climate change policies. But you're also very familiar with the world of meteorology, having spent many years working for Météo France and recently as a board member. Building on these 2 chapters of your professional life, let me ask you a few questions about what you think the future holds. First of all, we know the world's economies have to decarbonize and that we all should work towards building a new decarbonized economy. In this new economy, how would you characterize the role and importance of hydrometeorological data, information, and services?
Well, I think if we look ahead for, I don't know, 2030 or 2040, and an economy that is becoming decarbonized, but also greener, and greener means more efficient. All of that, if you think of agriculture, means that using less nutrient, using less water in buildings, it means using less energy for heating and cooling. All of that always require a much better control of the environment and better knowledge about not only the weather and the climate now, but also being able to predict it. So this efficiency that we will have to see everywhere in the economy will make the availability of weather data and forecasts even more important. There is another dimension, which is the use of renewable energy. And as you know, the renewable energy cannot be dispatched. You turn not on and off a wind or solar. So it's cheaper, but it requires to anticipate much more the supply that will be available and the demand for energy, and being able to adjust our demand to the supply that will be available. Again, to do that efficiently, we need very good weather information and forecasts. And finally, we think we'll use more and more what we call nature-based solutions. So not trying to use infrastructure, hard infrastructure for everything, but managing floods, for instance, with a mix of wetlands and dikes. And again, when we rely more on nature, we have to know it better, and weather information will play a bigger role in there. So this green growth that we're all after is much more dependent of being aware of our environments and being able to forecast it. So the role of hydromet will of course increase. And we can talk about the other side of the coin, which is living in a world that's changing because of climate change, which means that we need to monitor what's going on much better to see if something changes in ways that we did not expect so that we can adjust to it. And a world probably with more natural disasters, making early warning systems and the ability to act upon them more important. Again, here, hydromet services will play a key role. So I see only growth in that sector when I look at 2030 and 2050 with a much more central role interacting with all of the sectors of the economy.
Moving on, let's take a look at the relationship between the global weather enterprise, which we define as an engagement of the players in the public, private, and academic sector, and the new decarbonized economy. How do you think this global weather enterprise should be structured to best help maximize the efficiency and economic benefits arising from the new decarbonized economy?
So it's a very good question, because the sector has been changing very, very fast. In most countries, the hydromet was a public service, and now we see much more capacity and services provided by the private sector. And like always, when you have big changes, we have to just adjust the way we regulate and manage the sector so that we can benefit from the value added of the private sector and articulate it with what the public sector is providing. I think one thing important to start from is that this is not unique to the hydromet sector. If you look at education, health, transportation, in all of the sectors, we also have a mix of public and private actors, and we have experience in regulating the interactions with those sectors. So I think that the first key ingredients is to step away from this competition with different actors providing the same services to try to find the comparative advantage of different type of provision so that we can benefit from whoever is best to produce different things. You ask about the model. I don't think there is one model that will be used everywhere because it's so linked to institutional traditions in countries. I mean, we have countries much more centralized, others much more decentralized. We have countries where the public sector is playing a bigger role than in others. So I don't think there is one model that we can just put in all countries and it's going to work. Everything needs to start from the current situation and build on it depending on the strength and the culture, institutional culture in countries. But there are two dimensions that are really important. One is that hydromet services will be used for their economic value by many firms, many households, but there is also a public responsibility linked to the safety, like early warning system, natural disasters, and the monitoring of the environment, which is a responsibility of the public sector in most countries. So one first thing that we'll need to do is to ensure that we maximize the economic benefits of the commercial parts while reinforcing the ability of the whole system to deliver on safety, early warning systems, and monitoring of the environment. The second dimension that's really important is this trade-off between funding and accessibility. So if you have a forecast, its value is maximized if everybody has it. So you want to make it available for free to anyone, the easiest possible way. If you do that, you're left with a funding challenge. So there is this tension. We want to generate flow of revenues so that we can fund the infrastructure, the observation systems, the satellites, computing, and so on. But at the same time, we want the end product to be available for all at the lowest possible costs. So it calls for very different funding mechanisms that, again, will be different across countries. Some countries might be able to use taxpayer money for all of the basic infrastructure. Some countries might not be able to do that. So in some cases, you will have some mixed hybrid models with some part that's commercial and some parts that's a public service. This is something that really needs to be designed at the country level. But we have to invent the right regulatory mechanism to make sure we combine private and public sector here.
Thanks for this great food for thought, Stefan. We'll be following up on your comments during the panel session. Now let me welcome Johannes Lin. Johannes, you're an economist with many years of experience in development finance and more recently in climate finance too. You chaired the first Green Climate Fund replenishment in 2019, and since 2021, you've served as the global facilitator for the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, also known as SOF. So you have a good overview of some of the key aspects of the global and national weather and climate enterprise. Let me start by asking you, why should policymakers and decision makers care about weather and climate services?
Thanks, Anna Maria, and it's a great pleasure to join you today and join this conversation. Maybe just to clarify, until about a year and a half ago, I really had no idea about meteorology. I knew just what I saw on my cell phone, and I was always impressed by how accurate, in many ways, these predictions were in terms of the weather for the next 2 or 3 days. But I also, of course, realized beyond that it was pretty weak. So it got weaker as the days went out. Now, when I joined the effort to raise money for the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, or SOF, about a year and a half ago, I had to learn very quickly some basic elements of meteorology. And, I've become very impressed with and really committed to the agenda that our policymakers nationally, but also internationally, both in sort of the development space, but also in the climate space, have to be much better informed about how important weather and climate prediction, weather and climate services, leading to weather climate prediction, and then the downstream elements in the hydromet value chain, how important the upstream hydromet information and data are. And so, okay, why does it matter? Well, it matters because every day or every hour even of improved prediction helps you take steps to actually address potential negative impacts, or for that matter, positive impacts in terms of how you can react as a farmer, how you can react if you're in the transport business. For example, airplanes depend, of course, on weather forecasts, wind and what have you. Shipping depends on it. So accurate forecasts of weather is critical for many economic actors. Accurate climate prediction, of course, and measurement, actually what's happening on the ground, is critical, of course, for us to take appropriate action, both in terms of mitigation and in terms of adaptation. So I've become convinced that without good data, we don't have good prediction. Without good prediction, we can't take adequate action in a timely manner. And I can give you an example, very personal. I spend quite a bit of time on a lake in upstate New York, right by the water. And I've noticed that the water goes up and down because it's being regulated. Well, when you have big storms, and we had big storms last summer in the area, you need to have that information days ahead of time to adequately regulate the water level. If you don't, and we had a problem with that last year, we actually have serious flooding. And of course, that's just a small example of how similar problems occur elsewhere. Now, the reality is that the biggest bang for the buck in terms of improved weather forecasts and climate prediction can actually come from better data in the least developed countries and in the small and developing island states, because they currently are the least well served in this regard and can benefit directly, but also actually improved observations in these countries will help improve weather prediction and climate prediction in the OECD countries. And therefore, I believe it's very important that national policymakers in both the advanced countries and in the developing countries pay more attention to weather observations, meteorological observations, and the hydromet agenda than has been the case so far. And I'm a good example of this because, as I said, I've been in the development business, including at the World Bank as a vice president in charge of operations, and I never paid attention to the hydromet sector. And if you'd asked me 2 or 3 years ago, is it important? I would have said no. So we have a big job to do. We have to educate people. We have to educate policymakers. We have to educate the average citizen for why this is important. And I hope to contribute to that. And I hope this conversation will contribute to that. Thank you.
Moving on to my second question. We know that the world's economies have to decarbonize, and we should all work towards building a new economy. In this new economy, how would you characterize the role and importance of hydrometeorological data, information, and services?
Right. Well, let me give you, let me start that part of the conversation perhaps with a broader reflection on the international climate architecture, which is important here because hydromet services and global hydromet architecture is really embedded in the broader global climate and development architecture. So if you look at the climate finance space, you currently have a proliferation and fragmentation that is quite striking. So you have the Green Climate Fund, which is perhaps the newest organization funding climate investments. You have the so-called CIFs, the climate investment funds. You have the Adaptation Fund, you have UNEP and UNEP, the traditional UN organizations, you have the Global Environmental Facility, you have World Bank, the other multilateral development banks, you have the International Fund for Agricultural Development, you have bilateral donors, you have foundations such as the New Bezos Foundation. All of them are engaged in this climate finance space, trying to do things in terms of investing in both in mitigation and in adaptation, and in a way replicating a pattern of fragmentation in the development finance space that we've had for years. For example, in the health sector, at the country level, you have multiple organizations dealing with trying to help countries improve their health sectors. Well, we now have the same problem, if you wish, or opportunity, one could also say, in terms of climate finance. And indeed, it could be an advantage because with more organizations working in climate finance and providing finance, you get more funds, you get more technical expertise, you can fill certain gaps that might occur. But fundamentally, again, looking at it from the recipient country perspective, you have a tremendous problem of coordination, of making sure that actually the interventions are part of a larger plan and aren't driven by individual donor interests purely, for example, or by individual ministries' interests. So we have a real problem here of fragmentation. And the question is, you ask, so what can be done about it? Well, in the development space, we have development finance space. We've had considerable efforts at donor coordination, for example, together with country program formulation by the countries and strategy formulations by the countries themselves. That has been a mixed success so far. And so it is going to be a big challenge to get all these different finance actors to come together, including, of course, also private finance actors. However, maybe the solution to that is actually something which South Africa has put together in connection with the preparation for COP26, which is to have the South Africa Climate Country Platform, as it's sometimes called. And what you have here is a program which brings together key donors who put in a clearly identified amount of money, actually a significant multi-billion-dollar program of external finance to help South Africa implement a well-defined program of mitigation as well as adaptation. And this is probably, it's this kind of really country-focused programming and coordination effort which is required and has to be replicated elsewhere.
Thank you, Johannes and Stefan, for your thoughts on the challenges facing the global weather enterprise as it positions itself to help address the evolving needs of business and society over the coming decades. Having touched on the importance of weather and climate information to help manage the future economy, the challenging roles of different actors, and the challenge of financing the enterprise, let's look at these issues in more detail with our distinguished panelists.
Great, thank you. So thanks a lot. Moving on back to the live regime. So interviews gave us a lot of points to discuss, a lot of things to unpack. I would like to ask our esteemed panelists to first share their reactions, responses. Since South Africa was mentioned, I think, Jared, we'll start with you. You've had it all, so I'll just briefly read it. So you've been an Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General of the WMO, a former CEO of the South Africa Weather Service, and CEO is not a very traditional way to call this position, so that's an interesting moment. You have master's degree in climatology and in public and development management, and right now you are director and founder of Disaster Risk Solution, an international consulting company based in Johannesburg. Jerry, what do you think? What's your take on what you just heard from all the experiences that you've had?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. So, interesting topic, and listening to the introduction as well from GFDRR has been a very interesting one because in the context especially of the IPCC report, which has just been released on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, which in a sense calls us from going from urgent to timely actions on a number of fronts. One is on governance, the other is on finance, on knowledge and capacity, as well as technologies, amongst others. And I think all of these do present an opportunity for the weather enterprise, and I emphasize weather enterprise, not just one part of it, which often is government when we speak of weather services, but the weather enterprise as a whole. there's a great opportunity for us to contribute to a climate resilient development. Emphasis on that, because I think that one of the key issues that we face is in the decade or so, in fact, in the less than decade remaining to 2030, where 1.5 seems to be the reality and probably beyond, which means increase in extremes and extreme events, which define in a way weather events in the short term define the long-term climate regime, right? Because that's all that climate is a long-term average of weather conditions over a period of time. Means that, you know, we are one lens of looking at what the future of the weather enterprise should be, and its contribution to a climate resilient development means that we have to use the risk and impact lens to economies rather than the traditional way in which we have only looked at it in respect of saving lives. Then we later on added livelihoods to that. I think it has to go to risks to and impacts on economies. Now, the new economy, let me take a slightly different slant to how it was defined earlier, and not that that was not correct, but that one of the things about the new economy is certain characteristics around it, including one, for example, which is that it is decentralized. Right? A lot of emphasis on decentralization. For example, someone did mention energy generation at a very localized scale. And so that instead of having this big infrastructure where we are dependent on centralized energy generation, that we can in fact have more decentralized systems. So decentralized, data-driven, for example, the current technologies and growth in artificial intelligence and cloud computing, which are opening up opportunities for even least developed countries or less developed countries to have access to computing capability without the requisite normal investment in supercomputers, for example, is starting to open up a whole new avenue of the possibility to run models at very localized scales, again, decentralized. And then, of course, the new economy is technology-driven. There's blockchain technologies, there's APIs, and all kinds of technologies that are making democratization, if you want to call it, of knowledge, of the generation of knowledge and information, even much more a reality than it was in the past. So in the context of a changing climate and certainly risks and impacts being very localized, the traditional method, allow me to use a phrase, the traditional method of spray and pray and hope that this information does reach someone and that someone knows what to do with it when they've received it, unfortunately, will not be the reality in the next decade, or even less, because that traditional method of weather surfaces operating at very low density observation networks and at very low resolution means that it can no longer be a viable system for early warning systems, because we would need localization, and certainly the growth of technologies and especially in the new economy are even going to be more important. And I know recently there was an incident around micro satellites, 40 of them kind of being hit very hard by a storm, a geomagnetic storm. But those microsatellites are going to be the reality for our future, because including those that have radar. And I mentioned radar specifically because most developing countries have now lost the spectrum. Those that have not had radar for quite a long time, surface radar, have lost that spectrum to other parts of the economy, including, for example, telecommunications. And as a result, are highly unlikely to recover that spectrum unless there's intervention, policy intervention. But that means that we have to rely on other sources of radar data, which is absolutely key for extreme events in particular. So new opportunities, of course, will require new capabilities across the weather enterprise and across all nations, whether they're developed, developing, or least developed. And so in that respect, I would say that in the decade or less than the decade that remains, a concerted skills development effort is required, especially in developing and least developed countries. And here's where the opportunity is, in my view. The opportunity is that in most developing countries, the state continues to be, or governments continue to be, the highest employer of highly skilled graduates in sciences and in other multidisciplinary areas. I think that in light of the new economy, it is quite important that we seek to intervene with weather and climate services in creating the core skills that the new economy requires, as I defined it earlier, but also including emphasis on governance, which then touches on policy and legislative interventions and services for this new economy and a climate resilient economy. Technology, as I said, AI, for example, and others, which are key to the next decade and beyond. Finance, someone mentioned the challenge of coordinating finance, and often on the government side, often the players do not have access to the finance guys in treasuries and so forth, because they're quite distant in that ecosystem from the decision makers, and often are not even connected in most instances to finances that are directed at development financiers, for example. So the emphasis then on resilience, and certainly the emphasis on climate hazards and exposure, means that there's an opportunity, I think, to turn that clock back and to provide emphasis on the management of risks or understanding risks to economies that weather and climate present. And therefore, if we are able to offer viable risk assessments to governments, private sector, and the private citizen, then I think the challenge that we have now of these traditional lines of what is the private sector and the public sector and the so-called public good, which can only be given by governments. I think that those notions need to be challenged and certainly turned on their heads. Because I think that the time of citizens waiting to be told what to do by a state in the face of extreme events and the kind of challenges that we have in building a climate resilient economy, those days, in my view, are gone and need to be challenged in the way in which you make services accessible, or weather and climate risk information and assessments available to everyone at the scale at which that they operate, at the very localized scale, beyond even the 250 or 50 kilometer square resolution that we often work with at a level of models in the weather enterprise. So my sense is that indeed the points raised about the weather enterprise needing to be much more relevant in the current context, even more relevant in the current context and in the future context of climate risks that all economies face. It is important that the entire enterprise, both private, public, academic, also work hand in hand in ensuring that we can provide the right skill set in those areas where it is most required across these three sectors, in ensuring that a climate resilient economy can be built and can be supported by the weather enterprise in the future. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jerry. I would like to pass the word to Celeste Saulo, who is the head of the Argentina National Meteorological Service. And since 2018, she has served as the vice president of the World Meteorological Organization. And she represents here also an academia side of equations. So Celeste is a scientist in the field of meteorology, climatology, and numerical modeling with vast experience in research and teaching and mentoring. Celeste, give us your thoughts on what you heard, and also if you can kind of like try to give it also through the prism of academic sector, because as we always say, it's a public, private, and academic, but somehow academia always goes the third one, while we may need to change that and start moving it much closer to the number one place. So I would like to hear your views as well. And for all the participants, let's try to keep the interventions for around 5 minutes because we want to hear everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha, and good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to share with you this space. So just to go straight to the point that you asked me, from these very interesting interventions, I would like to pick out a couple of items. First, I would like to stress the impact of fragmentation, this concept that has been raised by Johannes. As the head of the National Weather Service, I can fully understand and illustrate the negative impacts of that fragmentation. What do I mean? Institutional arrangements are difficult when the recipients of funding have to report to different authorities, ministries, and so on. Usually, national med services in developing countries are not at the top of the pyramid in terms of level of authority. So their participation can be disregarded or not acknowledged at all. You may have an authority at the level of a state or province that has direct access to funding from developing agencies. So, as recipients of funding, they make their own decisions and define their priorities without enough technical knowledge in terms of hydromet issues. As a consequence, they tend to start from scratch or tend to reinvent the wheel. That is expensive. It is not cost-effective, and usually, when the term of their political office finishes, they can barely show modest levels of success. As a result, social perception of meteorology, its value, its impact becomes downgraded. This negative feedback, what I mean is this negative feedback between high investments, sense of too much money spent with poor results, low appreciation of the value of MedInfo, so you need again more money and so on. This negative feedback may repeat forever, unless funding agencies or donors or bilateral agreements help to improve these institutional arrangements. On the other hand, you have other possible recipients of funding, the academic sector. This is a completely different actor. They know the state of the art. They will not reinvent the wheel. But chances of weak interaction with national med services are high. And the effectiveness of these investments in terms of improved data and climate services will likely be very low. Again, this is a problem that critically affects less developed countries. Why is this so? Because unlike developed countries, there are no areas of research and development in smaller national med and hydro services. So the connection between the academia and the weather service is much more complicated. That is a real weakness for many national med and hydro services, and one I particularly care about, given my background, as you say, and my current experience. While the World Meteorological Organization, through the Research Board and the technical commissions, have the goal of strengthening the science for service concept, this is far from being achieved in, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years. Again, funding agencies have a critical role to play here. Let me finish this first intervention by quoting some of the issues mentioned by Stefan. I couldn't agree more with him that there is no ceiling for growth of this sector if we secure the proper arrangements, regulations, and social awareness. This is particularly urgent under the paradigm of a decarbonized economy, a green economy that becomes even more fragile and exposed to natural hazards under a changing climate. In my view, there is room for growth if each player adopts the optimal behavior for the benefit of all and not for his own. In these regards, we must work together to raise the awareness of decision makers with respect to the importance of weather and climate information, and also pointing out the role that each player has in this game. As a global weather enterprise community, we should all raise our hands when we detect that a player is not on board. This should be a commitment of this community if we want to succeed in this enterprise. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Back to you, Masha.
Thank you, Celeste. Moving on to Peter Platzer, who is the CEO at Spire Global. Peter was named by President Obama White House Champion of Change. Prior to launching Spire, he trained at the European Council for Nuclear Research and the Max Planck Institute. In your background, you have from Wall Street to space industry, and you are a representative of this private sector, which is quite honestly sometimes even misunderstood in some countries. So what would you like to share in as a reaction to what's been said before?
Thank you for having me here and sharing, what our personal views. And what is interesting is that, you call me a representative of the private sector, and yet I will find myself, as you will hear, arguing vociferously for the public sector here. Having, as you said, worked on Wall Street, I think we just look at the geopolitical events happening right now. The belief that individuals will act in the interest of everyone and not themselves, I think is just not going to happen anytime soon. Climate change is a classic public good. And without the public sector stepping in and basically taking taxes and averting them towards fighting it, or policies that bring the externalities of climate change into the economic model, I do not believe the change will be made. And I think that's one of the core problems that I see, that the public sector, by and large, has been long on discussion, fora, councils, committees, and very, very short on action. Climate change is not a technology problem. It is not a science problem. The solutions exist to solve all of this. And I just want to bring the example of COVID, where we saw humanity actually come together and deliver things that everyone thought absolutely impossible. Namely, within a new virus in a period of 18 months, that virus was genome sequenced and billions of people got vaccinated. That normally everyone said would take a decade. If humanity works together, it can actually solve these problems, but the capitalistic side of the world will just not take up that mantle. So with the technology solutions being available, the cost for those technology solutions being minimal, I really feel that the prominence of the public sector, individually on a country-by-country basis and globally, has to be much larger. And that's where the global weather enterprise, I think, comes into play, because weather is another global commons. And other than environmental protection, which countries can do individually, it actually is one where individual countries basically cannot solve it for themselves. They do need large cooperation. And so I think we can look at the last 30, 40, 50 years of the global weather enterprise and look at activities, fora, organizations that have worked and those that have not worked in collaborating on a global basis and finding the funding, which often is in the hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis. So I think the funding clearly exists if there is collaboration, and there is, I think, learnings to be had of what works and what doesn't work from the global weather enterprise. And unfortunately, and I might be here like the capitalistic cynic, I do not believe that without the public sector owning that role of bringing externalities into a capitalist society, either through policies or through taxes, that this will keep on going for a substantial period of time and might become a runaway situation.
Thanks. Thank you, Peter. I think you just set the scene for the completely different conversation we'll have to have at some point. I would like to give a floor to Nicola Ranger. She's the head of Sustainable Finance Research for Development at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, University of Oxford. She's been with the bank for some time, and right now she's gonna. I would like to just basically kind of like summarize a little bit. Like, we've heard a lot about climate finance. We've heard a lot about components of this global weather enterprise. How do you see it from your climate finance architecture experience?
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Well, I want to give a little bit of a perspective as someone who comes from the development community, but now works in the finance side. So, and particularly looking at climate data from a financial sector perspective. And I guess what I'm seeing, and I've been working in this area probably since about 2005, is a massive change in what we're calling here the weather enterprise. And we've talked a little bit about this. We've talked about technology, we've talked about the growing role of the private sector, but really I can't emphasize enough how fast a change we're beginning to see in these areas. And we've talked about some of the drivers for that. The increasing demand from a whole range of economic sectors. We've heard about energy. But now, look across big multinationals who are using weather information to optimize their supply chains in real time. This is a massive enterprise now. We're seeing infrastructure operators owning their own climate and weather information. We're seeing a vertical consolidation in the market now for these types of firms. So, recently, Moody's buying out Risk Management Solutions, buying out also various other data providers. So we're seeing this huge change in the market, and I see opportunities from that, and I do want to talk about the opportunities, but also risks, particularly for emerging and developing economies. So just to sort of pick up particularly this area of demand from the financial sector, which I think is only just beginning to land, and I think is going to drive this even more rapidly. So, we now have all the G7 countries moving towards mandatory disclosure of climate risks by all large financial institutions. So this is a significant portion of the global economy will be requiring climate data that never required it before. And again, this brings opportunities, but also risks. And it's G7 countries, but these are big global financial organizations that invest all over the world. So this will have big impacts on developing countries as well. And what I see in terms of the opportunities then, so obviously, firstly, this massive demand for data is a huge opportunity for developing countries in particular. If I were an investor now, I would be investing in companies in developing countries that are providing this data. This is an enormous growth market. But also it brings risks, and what I see as some of the risks, and we've talked about this link between the public and private sector and the risks of this decentralized approach. But what I really see, so when I see the way that the market is changing, the risk of crowding out public sector financing. So if governments see that actually the private sector is providing more, if they actually start to pull back, And we've heard about how the public sector is so important in ensuring, basic public services, early warning systems, the inclusiveness of this data. So ensuring that the poorest and most vulnerable people can benefit from this data. So that there's a risk there. There's a risk in terms of misuse of this information. And we're already beginning to see this. So we're beginning to see investment being pulled out of areas that are seen as higher climate risk. So there's I think potential parts of the world being left behind through misuse of weather information, and also a lack of transparency over weather information. This is something that we're seeing. So we're seeing now weather information being baked into indices that corporates and financial institutions are using, and a real lack of transparency about that data and the quality of that data. And then that can potentially lead into investments being drawn out of developing countries. So I think this is a really big issue. So there are opportunities and there are also risks. And then just finally coming on to this excellent point that Stefan made about the financing mechanism. So I do think we need to think about new models for financing. We need to look at, how can we ensure that when private sector actors are investing in climate and weather information, that this is a public good as well. So how can we look at bringing together new sources of financing from the private sector with a public good aspect, but then also importantly scaling up the public sector financing side. And I really do feel that there's an important role for the multilateral development banks in this area in particular. So I'll stop there then. So, there is, to summarize, a juggernaut is already moving very fast, and it's going to be moving even faster in changing the weather enterprise. And this brings massive, potential opportunities for developing countries, but also some risks that we need to be looking at how we manage through good public policy and also through good public investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. A lot of points have been picked up during these interventions. I would probably just then use this opportunity and ask the question to Stefan and to Johannes, building on what Nicola has said. So new models for financing. We realize that we're in the environment when we have a lot of actors. We have national hydromet services, private companies, universities, international development institutions, national finance authorities, and yet there is a sense that there is an element of disconnect between the decision makers or economic community, so to say, and the weather community. So what can be done to bring these two together? And to add, based on the questions that we have in the chat, and it's a pretty fascinating discussion that is happening there, so if you have a chance, scroll through it. There is a lot of a driving force coming from the private sector, which is also slightly disconnected, or maybe not slightly disconnected, from the formal climate finance architecture. So what are those points and the opportunities to bridge this element? So a decision makers, economy, and weather community, plus private sector and formal climate finance architecture. Stefan, if you wanna start, and Johannes, you can continue if that's okay.
I can be short, and it's a really an important and interesting conversation. I guess the first point I think we should really start from is this idea that a public good can be produced by the public sector or by the private sector. If you look at health, private hospitals are providing a public goods, just they are regulated to do that. And if you have a hospital in many countries, for instance, you cannot reject people in your emergency room. So the right to have a business in health comes with obligations. And I think we can really think along the same lines for hydromet services, that you might want to build out this hybrid system, but provided that the regulations are such that you create those public goods. I think Nicola's point is really important, and it's related to the discussion in the chat about how you make the need for these services and information clear also for ministers of finance and other players. The fact that investors are increasingly asking for hydromet and climate information and required to ask for it for disclosure mandates means that for your economy, having this information will be necessary. And I think we should really use that line of argument and the risk that Nicola emphasized. If as a country you're exposed to high risk and you cannot provide the right information, the risk is just to see investors go somewhere else. So it's not only this security issue that we had. There is also a huge question for the finance. And I want to finish on the last thought, which is if you discuss hydromet services in Europe, for instance, you'll have all of the security apparatus in the room. There is also like a national security component, both in terms of security of the people and properties, but also in terms of knowing what's going on your territory. So I think when we talk about the role of the private sector, we cannot completely ignore this dimension of national security and being in control of this data, especially as it becomes more important for energy security, national security, and finance. So I think this link, this synergy between the public and the private sector will be achieved only if we recognize the specificity of this market and not ignore those aspects. But I mean, that could be a much longer conversation. I hope we can have it in this series of seminars. Thank you.
Thank you. Johannes, and then we'll move on to questions, and I see Peter's hand is raised, but I would like to first hear from Johannes.
Sure. Thanks, Marilena. I just want to maybe say a few words about the systematic observation financing facility, because I think this initiative responds exactly to Nicola's call for scaling up public sector financing in support of closing the observation gaps that we have around the globe, and we have especially in LDCs and in SIDS. So what's the problem? Why do we have this gap? Well, we have three additional gaps, which is we have a gap of analysis. We don't really know what's the story is in these countries in terms of where the biggest problems lie. And so we need to close that gap. And SOF is in fact one very important part of its work is precisely to get better information of what is not being done at the local level, why it's not being done, and what needs to be done to close the observation gap at the national level. And by the way, it's not just a matter of producing, the gap is producing the information, the weather data, it's also sharing them globally. So how, which countries, which stations are actually not producing information but are not sharing it. Secondly, we have a gap in coordination of investment. So we have a lot of it, the same problem fragmentation that I mentioned more generally earlier in the climate finance space. We have exactly the same problem in the hydromet space. And so getting together in a coordinated fashion, the various actors that are trying to, do a better job investing in hydromet and weather data gathering at the local level in these countries will be critical. And this is what SOF will in fact do by working together with the MDBs, with the UN agencies, but also with private sector enterprises, HMAI and others to make sure we have a coordinated approach at the country level. And finally, very, very importantly, it's the sustainability of assets. Well, we've invested a hell of a lot of money already in improving weather information and stations and whatever in developing countries. But over the years, a lot of that capacity has very quickly deteriorated, and that is because not enough money is being put in on a sustainable basis and cannot be put in by these poor countries because they simply don't have the resources. So again, SOF will address this by actually providing ongoing support, financial support on a results-based financing basis to the LDCs and SIDS that requested and needed. So grant money for operations maintenance for sustainability of the assets. So this is what we have to put together. We have to put together a comprehensive approach scaled up to meet the level of needs of 75 countries that we have. And this is precisely what we're in the process to do. And it is, as many of you said, it's a global public good phenomenon. If we don't have the right incentives for private and public actors to actually take the necessary steps, both in terms of
the analysis, in terms of coordination, and in terms of sustainability, we're not going to get there. So SOF is an effort to do that. I think it's a very innovative effort. And by the way, I think it's an effort that could be path-breaking in terms of how we approach global public goods funding and organization more generally. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannes. I think the issue of incentives and creating the right framework for these incentives is something that should be addressed clearly. Peter, the floor is yours. And Michael Staudinger after that.
Just two small things I would say. The provision of public goods is always done by the private sector that is contracted by the public sector. And so there is a long and broad history, someone mentioned hospitals, of the public sector contracting the capabilities of the private sector to provide public goods. We are doing this, right now. And I think that is really not the bottleneck. Those mechanisms are really well understood of how the public sector can contract with the private sector to provide a public good. Let's just look in a global enterprise of any of the satellite programs. All of those satellite programs are built by the private sector, right? And they provide a public good. So that is really a solved situation. And I think the other one that I want to make, and I'm sometimes surprised by that perception that we don't have the answers. Do we have the answers 100%? Absolutely not, right? Clearly this is an extremely complex, interconnected phenomenon, but we do have answers of what to do with 80%. We could do this today. The technology truly, absolutely, unquestionably exists today to make a massive dent into the continuation of climate change, to drive the world towards net zero. Can we today create a plan to get us there with 100% certainty? No, we don't. We don't have the answers. But that is also not how progress is actually generally made. It is made through iterations. The cars that drive around the Formula One circuit today have been iterated over the last 150 years from the first car that was being built. They didn't know how a Formula One car is going to look like when they started to build the first car. And we don't have to have all the answers today. Because I believe the one thing that we actually do not have is the time to keep on debating and discussing and trying to come up with the perfect answer, rather than an answer that is shipped and implemented today. And for that, the technology, the skills, the answers do exist.
Thank you. Michael Staudinger?
Thanks very much. And have to do it again. We need to create what I think Peter Prater has now answered it perfectly. No? The public good can be given only by the public sector. In SOF, we try to overcome this and have 4 different business models between this being done classically by the public sector towards this being completely done by the private sector, the observation network. No? And on a result-based funding. What's really trying to look in developing countries is the regulator mechanism which you need to, first of all, to choose the right business model. Second, to evaluate if that's what you plan to do has been done in the right way. So what do you think, having been between the public and the private sector and having experience in both sides, what do you think the know-how you need for the regulator? Because this is what we have seen in other sectors where things have gone wrong, where things were provided by the sector. What do you think would be the best know-how on a national level, on a regional level, in the developing world, to have the regulation done in the right way?
Michael, the sound was slightly off, at least on my side, so I'm not sure if it was a specific question you addressed to someone on the panel, or it was more of a...
It was for Jeremy, who should do the regulation? If private sector, that's what yesterday for observation systems, for example, had been doing.
No, thank you very much for that question. And in fact, it does link to the previous discussion on the financial sector and the growth of demand for data, because in the end, that's the driving force, right? And I think the history of developing countries, and speaking of a continent that I know much better than any other, is precisely that when it comes to economies of scale, right, countries have always focused on their own territory. And unfortunately, even med services in countries have focused only on those observation networks that are under their direct purvey, and not any other observation networks outside of their purvey. So when there's discussion about coordination, I think one of the first things to do is precisely to have coordination at a national level across the sectors, because academia, there are observation systems, in other government departments, there are observation networks, and in the weather service itself, there are observation networks. And then on the continent, there's also the opportunity to go to a sub-regional level. And that sub-regional level means it's a collective of countries that all share the same common, and all of them are members of WMO, but they also have these other subgroups in their national, in their countries which belong to agriculture and that department and that department. So I think often when we challenge this notion about is a climate resilient economy in the future going to be built on the same systems and foundations of World War II institutions? The short answer should be no, it cannot. Some of those institutions have to be tempered with, and one of the ways of tempering with those institutions is through regulatory mechanisms and also policy interventions. Now, whether those policy interventions, for example, that encourage cross-border trade, those are already, some of them are already in place, where countries can trade freely. In SADC, they can trade freely. However, for interventions such as, can you get a private sector player to come and put up a radar network across SADC, right, which makes sense from an economy of scale perspective, if every government in SADC will contribute towards ensuring the sustainability of that network, and that network only being dependent on donor funding. Yes, it's possible, but it will require policy intervention and regulatory mechanisms. And then you can stretch that to the whole continent, because in a sense, this free economic trade area for Africa that's just been agreed a year ago and is in the process of ramping up is a golden opportunity, I think, to bring some of those discussions to bear on the weather enterprise. And unfortunately, again, because at national level, we have a disconnect between leadership of weather services in government and the guys who run and drive the finances, including those that regulate the FDI or foreign direct investment requirements like treasuries, right? Means that these conversations on the weather enterprise are not happening in those forums or those platforms where the free trade requirements are being discussed. And this is why my emphasis then was there needs to be capacity intervention, because Africa and the developing countries should not only be repositories of data where everyone comes and taps and complains when they try to sell the data to make ends meet, but it needs to be, we need that shift, that they also need to be capacitated to be able to be equal players in the ability for everything from data analysis to artificial intelligence, to the use of cloud computing, to creating the solutions, and not just being repositories of raw data that others will take from them and go and most of those players are not even on the continent. They global multinationals. And so you have a resentment in a way that starts to build around those kinds of interventions. So that's why I agree with the viewer from Celeste about coordination, and also the view of SOF, which is you need some interventions at a global and a regional level. However, those conversations that require intervention and skills at policy level, finance, And technology intervention, well, maybe the technology one we're kind of used to because a lot of people have invested in observation networks over time. But the other gaps in the conversations are not being addressed. And I think they do need a rapid and very intensive intervention so that when you listen to Peter, for example, talking about, you listen to Nicola, that those conversations make sense to a head of a weather service who is a technocrat, right, and understands better about the observation networks and very little else about policy and policy interventions. Sorry for the slightly long intervention, but you get me fired up when you speak about these things.
That's exactly the goal. Celeste and then Nicola.
Yes, thank you, Masha. Just very brief, because I'd like to pick up the discussion I saw in the chat between David and Johannes. I think that I want to highlight that there is an issue we need to solve with respect to increasing the visibility of the importance of met and hydro info for decision making. Although we hear, many of us are speaking about this right now, I cannot see this discussion replicated outside a relatively limited community. And this is something we have to worry about and think of better ideas besides just showing the value of MedInfo, because up to now we haven't succeeded with the tools we've applied. So most of the decision makers around the world, for example, cannot link, let's say, the IPCC last report with respect to risks, with the role of NMHSs and the private sector that generates information that help to inform decision about adaptation. Though that link is not built yet. They read IPCC and they cannot link that with this global water enterprise. So we have to do something there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nicola? We cannot hear you, Nicola, for one reason or another.
Oh, hello, sorry. So just two points. So one is to build on Peter's point, that to re-emphasize that, you know, that the opportunities here are massive, and yes, there are risks, but the risks are actually manageable, and we know how to do it. You know, they're the same tricky issues that we deal with, but we know how to manage these risks. And I think focusing on the opportunities and how we get the most out of this is the key thing. My second point was around building on Jerry's point about capacity, which I think is absolutely essential, and the role of the different actors in this ecosystem. So we've talked a lot about government, we've talked a lot about the private sector, but actually there are a whole range of other actors. And I see, you know, Jano here from the Red Cross Climate Centre with us today, plays a really important role. And so, and I also wanted to give the example of my own centre, so which is I know is a UK example, but I think is something that could be translated. So in the UK, the government, as part of our green finance strategy, recognised that, you know, there was going to be this massive need for data, and that the private sector plays a really important role in that, you know, particularly in weather and climate data, but also the need for other bodies and including academic institutions that are there to help provide this capacity and also transparency. So our role, so I work for the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, is about working with the private sector and with the users of information to help create the transparency and build capability across all users. And you know, this is a UK example, but I think that model, and we need these new institutions in developing countries as well that can help create that transparency, increase knowledge, increase capacity in this new world. Thank you.
Excellent points. Johannes?
Well, just to confirm that what many have now said, that let's call it the understanding gap is dramatic. And it's, you know, I was struck specifically when I talked to potential donors for SOF, because many of them initially tell me, no, we don't need better data for observations. We've got plenty of weather data. What we really need is better capacity for early action, actually getting things done at the end of the downstream part of the value chain. So that understanding that really it's the upstream part of the value chain where we do have important gaps and where relatively limited investments, my God, $400 million over 5 years and then $50 million on an annual basis is peanuts if you look at it in the broader context, and it's peanuts in relationship to the $5 billion annually that G-bond compliance, universal G-bond compliance, supported by SOF would provide. It's a cost-benefit ratio of 1 to 25. But bringing that across, for some reason, has been just extremely difficult. And so what we need to do is exactly, I think, the agenda here is, number one, to do more and more effective studies along the lines that Stefan and his colleagues have already done in actually estimating the benefits. Socioeconomic benefits, climate benefits, and what have you. But the other, and this was mentioned already, we have to rope in the private sector. So industry resilience, the providers, the actual users of this information have to be activated. And so SOF is reaching out to these, and in fact, we have them in the advisory board of SOF. But everyone, I think, needs to be more proactive in engaging with private sector counterparts, in letting them know that if you guys don't speak up, you're not going to get the data. These are free data. Under G-bond, the data will be made available freely to everybody. But that requires a financing mechanism and a willingness by donors to actually step up to the plate and say, okay, we have a global public good here, which has huge benefits, and we're willing to support it. So that needs an effective demand from, yes, indeed, precisely our private sector partners. Thank you.
Thanks, Johannes. Stefan, over to you, please.
Yeah, I think my point is very consistent. Is when we talk about this public-private partnership, we often think about the supply side, and I think we should also discuss about the demand side in the sense of who will be using this data and how we can help the public sector to use this data properly, but also the private sector, because in many cases you have a lot of data, a lot of forecasts and projections available, but it's not being used because it's not straightforward how to use it. So I don't know how that changes the picture, but depending on the countries, it makes sense to really focus on supply, because if you don't have any supply, there is nothing to use. But I would say in many places, it's very much in the demand side and how this is being used that we can make some cheap efforts. And if you do those cheap efforts, you start the pump, right? People start to use things, they realize it's useful, they see the gains, and you don't have to write those papers showing the benefit cost ratio. People know that it's useful because they experience it every day. When this pump is not started, it's really difficult to make the case. And I mean, economic papers go only so far to do that. So I think this is really a 4-quadrant thing: supply, demand, public, private, and often we look only at part of this full picture.
Great. More points to connect. More need for more for clearly more support to making the point. Unfortunately or fortunately. Okay, it's been a fascinating conversation so far, and just scratched the surface, frankly, because I think from every intervention of every panelist and every interview, there is enough material and food for thought for more discussions, more points to be raised, and more decisions that should take place. At this point, I would like to pass the word to Vladimir or to Niels for closing comments. And just to let you know that we'll summarize the conversation that's happening in the chat, because there are a lot of points that should be kept and followed up. We will post this this webinar on the website for any follow-up, and all our contacts, and I mean, you know everyone who is involved in this call, so please reach out if there is any specific follow-up that is needed. Now, Niels, over to you. Oh, Vladimir. Niels, you're on mute.
Sorry. Vladimir, do you want to close or do you want me to close?
Please go ahead. I can add one beat if necessary, but otherwise it's your first exposure to one of these events. So please, it would be important to hear your view.
Well, look, I mean, it's been super fascinating to follow the conversation and and the discussion. I have been reading several of the reports several of you have been authoring and producing also over the last year or two related to many of these topics. And clearly it's a space where there's a tremendous amount of opportunities, and that's certainly the positive side I'm taking out of this. No, but I did read in one of the more recent documents coming out related to this conversation that there also is maybe a conundrum from a development practitioner's point of view, and I think Stefan was alluding to that in his last comment in the conversation around the potential value for what the World Bank calls its client countries of improving quality in this space is enormous. And you have all been discussing and contributing different angles to that here. But the gap between where capacities currently are and where they need to be in order to take advantage of that potential value is significant in many of the countries that we work with and work in. And it sort of, the cost of getting that Formula One car increases, no? So the gap also from a cost point of view from where countries are to where they should be or could be taking advantage of the opportunity keeps growing. And that becomes a big challenge for people in the World Bank's line of work, no? Because it's sort of like, yes, the juice gets better and better, but it's going to cost you more and more to get there from where you are. So there is this, what to me appears to be a growing gap that I hope my institution will continue to look for better ways of having a dent in. I don't think we've done well enough looking back over the last decade. So there's lots of work to do for us, and we'll continue, of course, to do whatever we can to rely on you all. Vladimir and Masha will continue to lead the space from my small team's point of view. So I look forward to continue engaging and staying tuned with what's happening and see what small bit of the puzzle I can contribute with. So thanks a lot from my side. It's been super exciting.
Thanks, Niels. Just don't want to keep 60 people who survived this 1.5 hour. It's indeed been fascinating discussion, and thanks particularly to our panelists. Everybody did a great job. To me, it was basically continuation and confirmed that this sector is important. It has to grow. And another important thing, which I also felt personally, but then it was confirmed by everybody, that there is a need for greater public involvement, and there is a need to pass that message of importance of the sector to the higher level of decision makers. How we will do that within our institution, within a broader community, it's an open question. It's a challenge, and everybody, confirmed that this is a challenge. But this, at the same time, is exciting opportunity for us in this development space. Thank you very much. I think there is something else, Masha, you want to complete, but colleagues, I do have, this invitation for other events where we can dig deeper into more sectoral things and just find more solutions rather than, again, highlight the importance and the challenges ahead. Thank you so much. Masha.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to echo what's actually Peter put in the chat, Peter Platzer, and it's his personal plan. I think we'll share that to take this conversation and for each and every one of us to take this and convert it into just one action we each can take, translating words into actions. I think in this spirit we should try to move forward. Thank you very much for all the participants. It's been extremely fascinating discussion in this very complex times, but it needs to take place more than ever. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you
Bye-bye.
again. Bye-bye. Thanks,
Ciao,
everybody.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.